So we begin in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's important as we're going through this to remember that this was written many thousands of years ago. And so when we hear certain words, especially, these are English words that are common words, heaven, earth, right? We have a lot of baggage from culture, from our own language and how we use it within our culture, that these words mean lots of different things. It's important to remember to think about what did this mean to the people who first read it, and what does it mean in the original language. And we don't all need to be Hebrew scholars, but it can be helpful just to take things slowly and consider and allow the Word of God to stir up our imagination a bit. So when it says God created the heavens and the earth, when it says earth, what it is probably not in the mind of Moses and not in the mind of the Israelites who were first reading this was a spherical planet orbiting the sun in our solar system. It's not talking about planet Earth. What the Hebrew word means is the stuff that's under your feet, the stuff you're standing on. That's the earth. And when it talks about the heavens, it's not necessarily talking about outer space. It's everything that's up there, the sky and everything beyond the sky and all of that, all the way into the realm, the dimension of God, where God lives, God's space, if you will. It encompasses all of those things. And so Genesis 1:1 is saying is that everything under our feet and everything above our heads, everything was made by God. That's the point that it's making. And then Genesis 1:2, and it says that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And it'd be really easy to rush on because then verse 3 is really exciting. But if we go more slowly and think about, wait, what? So God's created everything, but we have an earth that ESV says was, some translations will say became. There's a lot of debate around this issue of, is there a gap? Did something happen between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 that caused the earth to look like this? I'm not going to try to answer that question here, but what I want to draw our attention to is the state of the earth, of the place that we know that we live now and that humans are going to live in this story very soon. And what is the state of it? It says without form and void. In the Hebrew, it's a very poetic statement. It's tohu wabohu. And the picture is when those words are used in the Hebrew Bible, it's always describing something like a desert or a desolate wilderness type thing. God will use that, I think, in Deuteronomy to describe the place that he took Israel out of in Egypt. That was, and if you've ever been to Egypt or seen pictures of Egypt and the sand, it's desolate, it's empty. It's not hospitable for humans. And so you get that picture in your mind. And then it also says, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And so now you're imagining this dark, deep, deep ocean. And then you're like, wait a minute, is it a desert or is it an ocean? What's going on here? And so right away, the writer of Genesis is introducing you to a literary technique that's going to be used all throughout the scriptures, particularly the Hebrew Bible, and its poetry and poetic ways of thinking things, where they'll throw real quick at you kind of what seems like two very different ideas, and that don't seem to gel together, and you're just like, wait, why? And you're confused, but that's okay. They're asking you to pause and think about those things and think how they're connected, how they're related. And it's a deeper way of saying something. It's a way of looking at something, a concept, an idea, a theme, from more than one angle to get a fuller grasp of what the writer is trying to say. So when he throws out a picture, a literary picture of a desert wasteland, and then he throws out in the same sentence a picture of a dark, desolate ocean, what do both of those things have in common? They're both places that are not fit for human beings. They're not places that human beings want to go and live. Nobody wants to move into the dry, desolate, waterless desert to live. We would die there. And if you throw human beings into the ocean, we die there too. And everything's dark, and it's just totally the opposite of what humans want and need in order to live. And so that's the starting point then for God beginning to do something. And we see the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. And then God says, let there be light. And so right away, you have this picture of a world that is dark, desolate, deep, not at all appropriate for human beings to live on. And then the Spirit of God comes, and the Word of God comes, and suddenly things begin to transform. Changes start to take shape. And I'm not going to talk about all the things in Genesis 1 that people love to debate about as far as what did this all look like and how long did it take and all of that. Because what I want to focus on is that right away from the very beginning of the story, God is making the point that things that look dark and desolate and like death are no hindrance or obstacle at all for His Spirit and His Word to come in and bring life and bring goodness. And so right away, God starts calling, as soon as He starts to interact with this world and bring change and transformation to it, He begins proclaiming it to be good. And so if we're trying to define what good is, what does it mean for something to be good from a biblical perspective? In reading this story, Genesis chapter 1, pay attention to what God says is good, what He calls good. And as each one of these days passes, these days of creation and transformation, He ends up calling His creation good a total of 7 times. That's not an accident. The author is trying to reinforce something to us. And of course, the crowning achievement at the very end is after He's made this, He's transformed something that looked dead and dark and desolate into something that's brimming, overflowing, abundantly filled with life. And it's all good, like it's all been good thus far. And then on the 6th day, God decides to add one more thing. And Genesis 1:27, probably if whatever translation you have, if it's an English translation, others often will like indent Genesis 1:27 or make it just sort of stand out from the rest of the text. And the reason the translators do that is because they're trying to draw our attention to the fact that up until now, in the Hebrew, it's been written in a style of prose, just narrative storytelling. And then when we get to 27, the author switches to writing in a poetic style. So Hebrew poetry is really distinct. It's super compact. So it's usually like a line in Hebrew poetry is usually only maybe like 3 words or so. It takes sometimes 8, 10, 9 words to unpack that into English. But it's really dense statements that are little couplets or sometimes like 3 lines that are all saying the same thing, but from different angles. And so why would the author suddenly switch in the middle of a story to throwing in a tiny little poem here, which is the first poem in the Bible, Genesis 1:27, first poem? Because this is brilliant. I mean, when you're reading a story, especially if it's an exciting story, if it's a good story, if you're really connecting with it, we have that phrase in English, this book is a real page turner, right? Because you're speeding along through it and it's just, you're having so much fun. And the Bible can be like that. And some of the stories are just so like exciting, and especially when you're reading it for the first time and you don't know what's going to happen with these people and you're just like pushing through it. You can miss certain details that are super significant and to the overall theme of the Bible, to things that the author really wants your heart and mind to make note of. And so what he'll do, this is so smart, is he'll switch from writing in a narrative style to inserting a poem, and then later we'll see sometimes they'll insert a song. And that's our cue as readers to slow down, stop, and ponder what was just said. Because you don't read poetry, or you're not supposed to read poetry, the same way that you would read a narrative story, right? A narrative story, you can read through it fast, but if you try to power real quick through a poem, you're gonna miss 99% of it. You're not gonna get it. You're not gonna understand, because poetry is often filled with, metaphors that the poet wants you to spend time unpacking and thinking about and letting it stir your heart, your emotions. Poetry often is meant to cause us to feel something. And so when the story stops and switches to a poetry, even if it's a short poem, it's like, ooh, you should feel something right now. So I'm gonna put like a little stop sign here for you to stop and think about what was just said and ask yourself, how do I feel about that? And so, interestingly enough, look at this, this is the first poem. This is the first thing that the author in this amazing story, this whole creation just got fleshed out by God from desolate darkness, and even before that from nothing, to now we have this beautiful, vibrant, full of life world. And God said, this is what it says, so God created man, and the word there, Adam, means human. And it's not just talking about God created a male human, it's saying God created humanity, mankind. And some of you might have that in your own English translations. He created man in his own image. And then it says, and this is where you see the Hebrew poetry at work, in the image of God, he created him, which is saying the same thing, but slightly different. Male and female, he created them. So what's happening here? So this creator God who, at this point in the story, if you're just, you're reading the Bible for the first time, like you don't even know how to picture, besides just whatever baggage or religious teaching you may have sucked up in your past. Like, how do you even picture this God? What does he look like? How do I imagine him? Trying to determine even what he's like and what he likes and doesn't like. Well, we can sort of get that from Genesis 1, right? Because we can see that he doesn't like void, formless, deep, and dark things, that actually he wants to come and fill and bring life, and these are things that he likes. He calls all of these things good, and creating a division between things like light and darkness, all of that, like he calls all of those things good. So we know he likes those things. And as we're looking at this world that he's made, which is so beautiful and so good, 7 times good, he wants to now put in it his image. And so why is this God doing this? Because he's not doing it fighting anyone. He's building something. And what is it that he's building? And one of the perspectives, the ancient perspectives on this is a story about God building himself a house that he's going to move in. He's laying out the foundation. He's setting up, the framework and all of that, because this is a place that he wants to dwell. And when we think about a house that is for God or gods, we generally call those buildings temples. So this is the story of God making himself a temple. Now in the ancient Middle East, and even like on into Western Greek Roman culture, if you walked into any temple, what would you expect to see? One of the things you'd see almost in every temple is you'd see some sort of image or representation or representative of that God in the temple. And so here we have God's made this place that he really likes, and it seems like he's ready to move in, but he wants to have his own image, his own representation, his own representative in this place that he's made. And that's humanity. And in fact, the word that's used there in 127, where it says God made humanity in his own image, salam, in Hebrew. That's the same exact word for image that will be used throughout the Hebrew Bible in talking about the idols that the various pagan tribes and that the Israelites were always tempted to fashion for themselves and worship. It's talking about those types of images, idols. And so one of obviously the commandments that will come later on in the story to God's people is, I don't want you making any images of me. I don't want you making any idols. And part of that is because in the very beginning of the story, God has established he's already made an image of himself. And it's you. It's the person sitting next to you. We are supposed to be the physical representations of this all-powerful God who is without rival and who's absolutely sovereign, which is just mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. And then, but Hebrew poetry. So we're looking at that statement conjoined with these other two. So he makes them, twice he says he made him in his own image. And then he says, and male and female, he created them. And it's not making like a third or a second statement about that same thing. It's a rephrasing, because this is how Hebrew poetry works. So it's trying to get you to look at it from a different angle. It's not just that human beings as biological creatures are in some fashion a representative and a representation of God, but it's the very fact that we're male and female together as one. Let me rephrase that. So the all-powerful God who is one, and we see no other actors, no other gods showing up in Genesis 1. It's just one. If there are other gods, they would have shown up and tried to fight him, because that's how ancient Middle Eastern myths work. This is not that. The God who is one, the best way that he represents himself is in a humanity that is one, but is more than one at the same time. Like, this is like on the first page of the Bible, God is already hinting at and sort of subtly whispering to, I am one, but I'm also more than one at the same time. And it's just right there in our creation. It's fascinating. And so he creates humanity and we're his image. And then on top of that, like how he makes us, there's no accidental details in the Bible. So, if it's giving you details about how we were made, we're meant to think about that and always think about, this is another useful tool when we're reading scripture. Think about what these things might symbolize or mean, and not just to us, but also to ancient people. So Adam, the man, human, that's really what that means. The first man's name is human. Human gets made out of material from the earth. So that sort of grounds us, like if you pardon the pun, like humanity sort of grounded in the earth, we're connected to the earth, right? But not just that, then he's not finished yet. He doesn't become alive. He doesn't become a living person, a living being, until God comes along and breathes the breath of life into his nostrils, the spirit. And it's that same, in Hebrew and in Greek also is the same thing, that the words for wind, for breath, for spirit are often all the same words. It's that same idea. So you have spirit from God coming and together with the earth, and you have humanity. You have the humans who are sort of straddling, like they got 1 foot in the earth, and then 1 foot in the sort of the spiritual plane, this sort of connection, this bridge, which makes perfect sense, right? If they're going to be representatives of this God in this good world that he's made, like that they're sort of like holding on to both. And it's the first hint of the human vocation to be priests, because that's what priests do. Is they represent the God or gods to the creation and the created. And so from the very beginning, that's who we are. That's what God says about us. That's a good story. What else does he say? He doesn't just make us, and then Genesis 1:20, after you've read 127 and you've gone and you've had a cup of coffee and you've thought about that and wow, all the implications, we could go on and on about the implications of 127. And then you go on to the next verse, and the very next thing that God does is it says, and then he blesses them. He immediately, upon creating humanity, he gives them a gift. And I would ask, well, what exactly did they do to deserve? Like, he's just immediately, it's like, happy birthday, here's a gift. He can't wait to bless them. And he blesses them with a very specific sort of challenge, command, directive. He says, I want you to go and make disciples of all nations. Actually, that is sort of what Jesus is rephrasing at the end of Matthew. What he actually says is, he says, go be fruitful, multiply. So here we have these image-bearing humans, and God is just like, oh, I love you so much, and I just want to fill the whole earth, this whole good world that I made, I just want to fill it up with you. And you're going to fill the earth, so you're going to scatter, and you're going to subdue the earth and reign. And he talks about reigning over all the various, the birds and the fish and the animals and all of these things. And at first I was like, what does that have to do with being image-bearing representatives of God? It has everything to do with that. Because what was Genesis chapter 1 all about? About God coming in and subduing and reigning over creation. He started out with absolutely nothing and brought everything into being. And then even on top of that, shaped it and brought form where there was no form, brought light where there was no light, brought substance where there was no substance, life where there was no life. He did all of that. And now humans, as image bearers, are going to get to do something very similar on a smaller scale. And it can be really easy when we're reading these things, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I want to introduce kind of our own bias on what do we think. So when I first, read the words, subdue and reign, I'm imagining like, yeah, we're the boss and we've got, going to crack the whip. We're going to make the animals, serve us and beat everything into submission. And it's just coming from a broken human perspective, right? And so that's why we have Genesis chapter 2. Because Genesis chapter 2 is sort of making the statement and answering the question like, what does that look like? What does that mean? Or I think it means this. And Genesis 2 is like, no, you got it all wrong. This is actually what it means. And it's sort of funny because often like people who are sort of critical of the scriptures are like, oh, Genesis 2 is just restating the same thing from Genesis 1. And isn't it kind of contradicting things? Or why is it doing this? Like, it's actually really brilliant. There's no accidents in the Bible. Every story is arranged the way it is, where it is, for a reason. And if you don't understand it, go have a cup of coffee, get a tea, pray, ask God, what does this mean? Well, why is this here? Because you're up to something. You're doing something. It's not an accident. So Genesis 2 is answering the question, what does that mean to reign and rule in the earth and over all these living things that God has made? And it doesn't look like, kicking the dogs and, beating everything. It actually looks like taking care of a garden. It actually looks like naming animals, understanding, and name. Got to bring that up. This is a hugely important theme throughout the Hebrew Bible and even into the New Testament, names and naming. A name in ancient culture meant way more than just what do I call you when I want to get your attention. Your name was representative of your character, of the essence of who you are, your identity. Your name is part of your identity. And because that's super important, that's why your parents get to name you, because when you name someone, you're taking authority over that thing, or over that being. Because you're saying, I'm giving you your identity. And that takes authority to do. And so it's a big deal for the human to be allowed by God to name the animals, he's taking authority over them, and he is giving them identity. He's establishing their purpose in partnership with God. That's a very significant thing. And then with the plants and all these trees, and like this garden is just like amazing, just overly abundant, fruitful. And they're going to be able to cultivate it. They're actually going to be able to make it more fruitful, which you think about it, it's just the most amazing thing. We take it for granted unless you're a farmer, and then it's like obvious. We have the capacity as humans to go and take whatever, seed-bearing, fruit-producing plant, whatever it is, and by cultivating it, fertilizing it, whatever, messing with the environment around it, we have the ability to make it more fruitful. We can prune things and fertilize things and encourage growth. So whatever's already bearing fruit, we can make it even more fruitful. We can bring even more life out of it. And we can do the same thing with the animals that we domesticate. If you put a few sheep out in the wilderness, they're going to reproduce and make a flock. But if you take a human, come alongside them and begin to exert authority over them and help kind of control, their pairing off and helping with the delivery of the lambs or whatever the animal is, like we can make sure that more of them survive and that the healthy ones get healthier and reproduce with the best and all that. We can make a tiny flock, a huge flock in a very, very short amount of time compared to what would naturally happen in nature. And that's like such a basic thing, but it is such a fulfillment and a callback to the purpose that God establishes for us in Genesis chapter 1 of subduing and ruling over in a way that points back to God, because those are the exact things that God has already done and is going to continue to do, to take where there's a little and bring more out of it, to increase life, to cause life to flourish, to abound. That's part of the character of who God is, and that's part of how we reflect and represent him.